Hello. With warfare seemingly creeping up on us, because governments keep starting them, it seemed like a good idea to speak to Ed Wall, Professor of Cities and Landscapes at the University of Greenwich, about his book Architecture for Warfare: How Corporations Profit from Destruction and Reconstruction, published by Jovis in December last year. It's difficult to know what to say about this, beyond what Professor Wall describes in the book. There is a seam of architectural practice which makes the infrastructure of war and reconstruction, and makes a good deal of good business whilst doing it. Isn't it better, one may well ask, that architects with their designerly imaginations, their theories and lovely drafting skills, and their spatial-technical and ecological competencies are involved in this sort of stuff? At least then it'll have passive ventilation. Jeremy Bentham, not an architect, drew the panopticon in the 18th century, and in so doing arguably more or less defined the modernist city. The great Alfred, Waterhouse, designed Strangeways in the 19th, and that's pretty lit. Then there was Speer, of course, in the 20th. So the connection isn't new. It still feels odd though, as Ed explains.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the A is for Architecture podcast. I'm talking today to Ed Wall. Ed, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to be talking about your book Architecture for Warfare: How Corporations Profit from Destruction and Reconstruction, which you published with Jovis in December last year, I think. It's a beautiful, almost like a pamphlet. It's a beautiful book, short book. And it tells a very, very interesting story, I think a very important story, particularly in the context of geopolitics as we currently have it, but also in relation to the contentious identity of the professional architect, and perhaps a rather hidden one. Before we get into that, and I'm fascinated by this story, as with all my guests, would you, Dr. Wall, introduce yourself?
Ambrose, thank you so much for the invitation to join you and also for the generous welcome. I am a professor of I'm Professor of Cities and Landscapes at the University of Greenwich. I've got one or two other roles, but largely I come with a background in landscape architecture and urban design, 10 years experience designing predominantly public infrastructure and urban spaces before returning to university life to become a teacher and researcher, which I've been doing for the last couple of decades. And the focus of my work, just to give you a little bit of background, the focus of my work is on what we might call spatial practices and ecological environmental processes, but specifically through concerns for spatial justice, and how some people win and lose out as our environments are transformed.
Spatial justice is a big one. Who do you build upon, particularly in your thinking and work?
I was taught in my urban design degree many years ago by Michael Sorkin, and his work and many people who have intersected or orbited his work are really foundational to how I read the relationship between architectural design and justice. I think that people like Ed Soja have been a really important influence, coming from more theoretical, more geographical or geography backgrounds. But I think that it's important through my practice work, but also through my teaching and research, to be able to make sense of how this meets the ground in our day-to-day lives, how our neighborhoods and streets are transformed, the relationships between the work my students and my friends and I've done in the past, how that relates to bigger systems and infrastructures and decision makers. I think that's partly where this book has come from.
Yeah. I'm not going to let you go without explaining a little bit more around what you mean by spatial justice, because I think, as you say, it obviously relates to the book that we'll talk about very closely. And I really like this idea of sort of taking that theoretical position of Soja and Sorkin and others and seeing how it deploys on the ground. As I understand it, in a sort of classical philosophical sense, justice is rendering unto people what they deserve. I guess the spatial justice literature tends to focus on the incidents in which folk are not getting what they deserve. How is it framed as a kind of general conceptual field?
Yeah, I mean, I don't personally, and I haven't thought through, let's say, what it means to deserve something or not to re and to not receive it. But I'm reminded, maybe by your nudge, my PhD advisor, a doctoral advisor at the London School of Economics in the Cities program, Susie Hall. She would consistently ask me, and she just push this in her own writing, and she would ask me who is winning and who's losing out from the changes that are happening. And I think that's a really useful question to ask when we think about. I live in London. If I think about the urban redevelopments that are happening, the transformations of some of the high streets, the changes in the occupation of certain shops or the tenure of people living in social housing. Um, as changes happen, some people gain and some people lose. And I think that we need to ask the questions and we need to bring to the light those processes that often happen with a certain acceptance that this is what happens in cities and this is what happens during urban redevelopment or and I think that there are implications for individuals, there's implications for families and communities, and whether that is a sanitization of our cities and in somewhere like London, whether it's the drop in school children and the closure of schools as a result of that, or the cleansing of neighborhoods, and there's implications of this question: who wins and who loses.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really fascinating. I was really surprised to discover that even in Hackney, I think last year alone they shut three primary schools
Mm, mm.
in
Yeah,
in a city with a growing population. That's a kind of remarkable moment.
yeah, and I think the implications for the diversity of urban life are huge.
Hmm.
If there's fewer young people, even if there's fewer schools, there's fewer community resources. Um, we have fewer teachers in the city, and I think that it yeah means a lot, I think.
It does. Obviously, I want to come to the book and how you came to this. Now, as I understand it, it was through personal experience that you first encountered this relationship between the business of architecture and the military industrial complex, the war industry.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was living in New York City at the time. I just finished a master's in urban design, as I mentioned, with Michael Sorkin, who was became a very close mentor for my work. And previously, before living in New York, I'd lived in Manchester, in the UK, working in really fascinating small landscape architecture studios. And I think, as many architects do, uh, held on quite a high pedestal the work of small, creative, innovative design studios. Um, in New York City, after graduating, the the nature of being a migrant is that you live quite precariously in relationship to your visa status, and I looked to firms, some medium sized, some larger, who would be able to sponsor my visa once my student visa expired. I also wanted to stay in New York City, and I um, got offered a position at a firm called EDO, which at the time was the largest landscape architecture firm in the world. It had about 2,000 or so people. And I'd had a role as an urban designer working at Edo. It was a small office in New York City, but a larger uh, organization or network of studios around the world. And I worked for them for several years. on some really fascinating projects, the last of which was the redesign or the design of the master plan for Governor's Island, which is a small island on the southern tip of Manhattan. Um, and one day we were the small office that we were in New York City of Edo. We were brought together by the directors, and we were informed that the firm we were within was being merged, which I think we understood, which was meant it was being bought out by a larger corporation, a corporation called AECOM. And then at the time, none of us, however experienced we were, had come across AECOM or their work. Um, and we were told that in a couple of days we would have a call with the head office and all the other offices around the world. We'd have a call where we could ask questions and we could find out a bit more about what this merger would mean. So really from there, my position of having no knowledge of this particular architectural and engineering corporation, uh, I did a little bit of research with some friends using Google and realized that behind this, let's say, this expectation of an architectural and engineering corporation, there was a wide range of services that they were engaged with, and it was this hugely wide range of services that both fascinated me at the time, but also raised concerns for how my work as an urban designer interacted with or supported, facilitated other services that ranged, went all the way into the military industrial complex.
You cite Dana Cuff in your book, and her,
Mm.
I think I've got the note here. She talks about how these particular type of company have been, in a way, consuming other architectural practices. Dana Cuff describes ACOM as swallowing large architecture practices whole, and doing so to create sort of integrated platform, the better to be able to deliver the entire infrastructure of whole cities. Quite interested in how this process came about. I mean, what is the background of ACOM?
Yeah, so Dana Cuff's book, sorry, not her article, I think it's called Architecture's Undisciplined Urban Desire. Her article gives a really interesting overview of this type of conglomeration, architectural engineering firms. Um, that probably the best reference for me was Aaron Kyer's book on called Incorporating Architects. That actually only came out last year, but it's a really interesting narrative about the corporatization of architecture in the post-war period, since the Second World War. And he traces the origins, it's an origin story of AECOM largely, through the merger of oil and engineering businesses with Dimjim, which was a very large architectural firm up until the 80s. And uh, what had happened in the post-war period in the sort of the in previous, I say, forms of ACOM was um, the embrace of military contracts by some architectural firms as the US military was beginning to privatize itself or be privatized. There were several firms that embraced these new contracts, and these contracts they ranged from building military bases to uh, quite complex military services around weapons and infrastructure. So there's quite an early history of architectural corporations getting involved in the military-industrial complex and military outsourcing. And AECOM basically came out of one of these corporations. If I remember my book correctly, it was founded in 1990 under the name AECOM, which I touch on in the book. A is understood to stand for architecture, E for engineering, and as the letters fade into C and O and M, it becomes a bit more ambiguous. But O and M are known within the military-industrial complex as standing for operations and maintenance. Um, and the AECOM really grew from 1990 from this architectural engineering position, even if the engineering was within and the architecture was within partly within military contracts. They really expanded their work to what I describe in the book as a sort of a full life cycle approach, where we could imagine a single corporation having the capacity to undertake almost any work that relates to a place. And that goes from, designing and building things that we're familiar with in architecture to establishing governments and police forces, security, infrastructure planning, all the way to establishing military bases, providing personnel to support military bases, and in some cases enabling the military invasion of countries abroad. Within really a short space of time from 1990, this firm kind of grew rapidly until possibly its closest engagement with the military world in supporting the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the US-led invasion.
So in a way, the architects are central to the production of warfare, but they must be at some point consulted within the planning processes for conflict.
Certainly in its earliest formation in the post-war period, trained professional architects were involved in some of the close decision making around these military contracts. However, I think that it's important, let's say, to make a difference between a military contract that might be for designing and building a military building, a contract with the Pentagon to rebuild the Pentagon after 9/11, or to build a military base that requires architectural knowledge.
Mhm.
It's quite a different type of service than other military contracts that were undertaken, which might be about hiring translators in countries abroad during conflict, or providing services to entertain military families' children. The range of contracts is so diverse that we should expect that architects aren't involved in all of them, and architects in some of these organizations may be oblivious to what is going on.
Yeah, I'd like to come to that, this idea of a kind of a hidden reality, a city within a city, as it were. I want to go back to this idea of the life cycle of war. I think we saw something of this during the Israeli destruction of Gaza, where even whilst the conflict was going on, the American government was proposing a reconstruction strategy that involved turning it into some sort of Middle Eastern Vegas.
Mhm, mhm.
Probably more like a Middle Eastern Los Angeles, really, more financial than gaming. Is this kind of where this work sits? On the one hand, people looked at that and thought, well, that would be better than demolished buildings or the prison camp architecture that characterized quite a lot of Gaza prior to the Israeli assault on it. It's the sense here that companies are actually sort of strategically positioned to help conceptualize those moves and in a way, therefore, rationalize the kind of destruction that precedes it.
Yeah, I think that architectural firms all over are well positioned to, and firms much smaller than AECOM embrace reconstruction projects. Absolutely, I think that there is a plan for Gaza that was published by I forget the name of the plan. It was published by the Washington Post. It's available on their website that actually has AECOM's logo on it. I think it relates to the plan that you're describing. Um, there is an opportunistic dimension to um, uh, large corporations, but also many businesses will look to see where they can get their next contracts from. I think that, and it's not unusual. I think that before uh, the um, the most recent incursion, occupation, genocide in Gaza um, by the Israeli military, we had AECOM having a contract, a US government contract to look at the provision of infrastructure in Palestine and Israel. I think that was $100 million US dollar contract, uh, which was cancelled under the cost cutting led by Elon Musk. And that was cancelled in the Trump administration. And what's quite interesting is that that's a US AID contract. It's a redevelopment, international development contract. Uh, the head of AECOM at the time, they said that they were uh, they weren't overly concerned, and I'm paraphrasing, weren't overly concerned about the loss of that particular contract because they expected to benefit more greatly or more significantly from the Trump administration. And they also highlighted that a significant, I'm not sure whether they stated the largest, but certainly a significant proportion of their income came from US military contracts. So I think that a large organization that provides a wide range of services is able to adapt to changes in geopolitics quite significantly um, if they're just being responsive. I think we also have to recognize that large corporations, not just in architecture, but large corporations, they set aside a significant amount of their funds for lobbying, for influencing government. And certainly many corporations within the military industrial complex, uh, it is in their interests. Military conflict is in their financial interests. So I think that the the distinct uh, practice of AECOM in the early 2000s that fascinated and worried me was the life cycle of profiting from Reconstruction at the same time as profiting from the destruction that was happening. So a firm that was contracted for reconstruction contracts, for peacekeeping contracts, for re-establishing government and rebuilding police forces, um, uh, also having a hand in the invasion and the destruction of the things it was tasked to rebuild. And I think that for me is one of the unique qualities at that particular moment of time.
I remember when I was doing my master's degree in Sheffield, and I did a small live project with some fellow students in Paris, in northern Paris, and we were shown a film and I can't remember the name of the film, and I've never found it again, but it talked about how the sort of construction of contemporary capitalism derived from two economists, British economists, I think, in the early 20th century, building on the logic of the First World War, which was that a dead soldier hurts the enemy, but an injured soldier is a constant drain on the enemy because you have to provide them medicine and care and so on and so forth. And so the logic of that particular conflict was much more to do with damage than it was to do with death. Death was ultimately the goal.
Mhm.
But by doing this, you could create a permanent cycle of capital accumulation. Every injured soldier is both a cost to the enemy, but it's
Mhm.
also an opportunity for profiting, which I was quite fascinated by. And it talked about the Exxon Valdez disaster, the sinking of that giant oil tanker up in Alaska, I think it was, wasn't it? Described it as the most profitable oil cargo in the history of the world. Because, of course, the amount of business that came off the reclamation and cleaning for ostensibly good people made massively more money for everybody, particularly for tax offices, than the oil ever would have done. And so I find it kind of interesting that we found ourselves in this position in architecture where you have these covert operations running through architectural practices. Because, of course, the self-image of architecture is that it is a common good. Like, it's sort of built into the professional identity. To be a professional is to work first and foremost for the commons. It's not for the client. So how do they square this? How is this squared within the logic of architecture as a whole? And I suppose that question points to this idea of compartmentalization within large corporations.
So certainly that's part of it, Ambrose. I think that the way in which architecture is perceived, and when we talk about architecture, I think we should, recognize that as, planning, landscape architecture, urban design, the design and considered, thought about the future of the places in which we live around the world. Uh, I think that the perception of it comes through the media, it comes through architectural awards like the Sterling Prize. It comes through architectural festivals, the Venice Biennale or London Festival of Architecture. Comes through the the sort of landmark buildings that we can associate very particular personalities with. Buildings, in cities around the world, really, the sort of the architects associated with them, and the image of that architect is usually somebody with a drawing board, usually a man with a drawing board. In a studio, they're not necessarily described as practices or firms or corporations. Um, they're imagined even as studios, and I think that firms like Norman Foster's are probably perfect examples that these are very significant corporations with hundreds, if not thousands, of staff making significant change around the world. But the perception is very, very different. Um, I think, and much of the discourse uh, around architectural design uh, exists in that ecosystem. The One of the interesting points of Aaron Kyer's book, Incorporating Architects, is the increase. I think he provides statistics. The increase in the corporatization of architecture since the 1970s has been huge. That the majority of architects, uh, and he's describing in North America, in the United States in particular, we look similarly to the UK. Architects are increasingly employed in corporations. They're not employed in studios. And I'm not. Uh, I think that there is reasons why that is happening, which come through the economy, come through certain decision making, and the privatization of industries in many Western countries. Um, but I think that I think we within the industry need to look closely at um, where do young architects go to work? If we're working in the university as you and I are, where are our students going to work? What is the skill set that they need? How should we prepare them? And I think that there's sort of a self-reflection in the industry that needs to happen. Um, and I think also a closer look at um, these places that are often hidden from the media discourses and the public discourses on architecture, the places where many of these people are employed, stay out of the view. So when big firms like AECOM or Jacobs or WSP, who employ many architectural designers, when they get new big contracts, often in the news, it's the smaller firms associated with those contracts that may be doing a very small part of the job that get highlighted in the media. And these larger corporations that usually sit behind acronyms are less discussed.
Isn't this in some way a sort of extension of the logic of post-war modernity? So it's unsurprising to me that a firm like AECOM, as you've described, emerges out of that moment. Because, of course, well, I say of course because I'm overconfident, but it strikes me, it's my view, that what we see in the post-war restructuring of British cities, American cities, is really the returning home of the imperialist logic which sort of desired to impose through a very hierarchical method. See Le Corbusier's work at Addis Ababa, or even Chandigarh, to be honest, seeks to impose a kind of external logic
Mhm.
with incredible vigor, incredible violence, really, cultural violence on those spaces. So it seems kind of, in a way, if modernity is a paradigm, paradigms have a beginning, they have an end. We're at the high point of that modernist, alienating, abstract thinking. And that
Mhm.
what AECOM are doing is in a way more architecture than these little frilly things, the phenomenological
Mhm.
ornaments that get built here and there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that their capacity to make huge spatial change
Mm.
around the world is phenomenal, and I think that I mean, I think it's worth recognizing that at a time when, in particularly Western governments, but many governments around the world are seeking private corporations to do their work.
Mm.
That the work of infrastructure, in particular, it happens at scale. The building of roadways, the building of rail networks, the building of new towns or entire new cities. That comes to the hands of private corporations and particularly corporations that have the capacity to say, yes, we have uh, this particular specialism and we have a scale of team that can undertake it. I'm sure you could tell me more precisely this is sort of the relationship with these types of architectural conglomerates and modernity. But I certainly confident that it fits within the advancement of capitalism, the an understanding of late capitalism, uh, a simple expansion of geographies of corporations, hand in hand with an expansion of services.
Mm.
Um, so I think that the outsourcing, um, the, the reason that we see firms like AECOM emerging from the United States of America is that the outsourcing in the US is more advanced. Uh, and I think that the in my research, the places that ACOM gains most traction, builds it most things, or makes most money, are places that have either a similar embrace of free market economics, or places that are um, embroiled with that machinery,
Mm,
either through warfare or through trade.
yeah. Sort of part of that, again, imperialist logic of a post-political transnational
Yeah.
practice, which again mirrors very closely notions of modernist thinking, i.e., we can have le modular, we can have the avatar of all humankind, and we can roll this out universally, allegedly for issues of justice, but which function absolutely against that.
Mhm, mhm.
I guess to finish on one last question, isn't it better that architects and architectural design thinking is involved in this work because we're really good at doing design? And wouldn't it be worse if we weren't there and these spaces were badly designed? Badly designed prison camps? I know that sounds terrible, but a well designed abattoir is better than a badly designed abattoir.
I think it depends what we mean by better design. I think that the cows moving through the abattoir, Ambrose, they have different concerns around design than the humans operating it. I think that for me, uh, I was posed with a very similar question when I raised concerns about about ACOM buying the firm I worked for. Uh, Back in 2005, I think that there is the question we have to ask ourselves in our work, how much influence can we have, positive influence can we have in our work environment? Uh, how persuasive can we be? Um, what is what is what are the opportunities to make that change? I think that I would probably return the question back to you and ask you how much change can individuals make in corporations if the change they want to make impacts the bottom line or the corporate structure and
Mm,
the corporate structure. Um, I think that we can see what's quite interesting in the research I did, and looking into a number of firms that have taken on large military contracts, um, uh, and there's a number, is that their form is constantly changing. There is a constant expansion of services that they offer, or and sometimes divestment of services. Sometimes spin-offs of 2019 or 2020, ACOM sold off its government services division to form a another corporation. Uh, it didn't stop them taking on military contracts, but I think many of the decisions that are made in large corporations, they're financial decisions that are largely about the bottom line. And I certainly came to the conclusion very quickly that I would have very limited impact on and make a limited positive contribution to ACOM if I stayed within it as and certainly from my perspective, it was the correct decision for me. The notion that my work would contribute to the destruction of people and the destruction of lives, even in a tangential way, was enough of a concern. And I think that it came to me really, and I think one of the few conclusions I think I draw from the book is that we have to ask ourselves: are there limits to the work that we do within architectural practice? There has been a move which is relatively silent at the moment, but there was a move actually led by Michael Sorkin in New York City, against architectural firms building prisons and detention centers in the United States. Um, you know, I think that there are limits to the practice that professionals who have a code of conduct and an ethical codes. Uh, there's limits to the projects I think that they should take on, that we should take on. Um, and I think that the question is both for the individual corporations, um, as well as the people within them, and the professional organizations who oversee them, regulate them.
This issue around the professional organizations, how do they square it? What is their role here? Because if we were to discover, for example, that a large-scale healthcare provider was also on its side hustle, which is bigger than itself, also delivering something like the opposite of what it was supposed to be doing, people would be blown away. General Medical Council would be over it like white on rice. It would be an impossible thing. And yet this is possible. What you're describing is possible. And as you say, the individual architect, or perhaps the small architect's practice, has no agency in this process because it's the bottom line, and it's a very big bottom line. It's huge profits, huge contracts. But at the level of the profession itself,
Mhm.
isn't there some sense that this could be resisted? Removal of right to call yourself an architect, for example.
I think it's a great question, and I think that it's a question that we should be asking the RIBA, the ARB, the Landscape Institute, the RTPI, accrediting firms, organizations within the UK, for example. But I think internationally, where these different corporations are either working or have professional standing, I think it's a really important question. I think the difficulty that I see is that the influence of large corporate interests extends into government. It extends into your professional regulators in the sponsorship of awards ceremonies, the provision of CPD, the sponsorship of architectural festivals, your architectural schools. It extends quite widely, and I think while you say that there would be a scandal if healthcare providers were involved in work that did the opposite of healthcare, I think we don't need to look too far into the news about some of the technology companies that are getting contracts now in the NHS and their involvement in warfare in the Middle East. Um, that there's sometimes a difficulty in bringing these concerns to make them visible, um, and an appetite for people to um, closely consider the contradictions. I think that our work is bound up with.
I think that's a good point to finish on. Thank you ever so much, Ed. It's been really very interesting, delightful to hear you talk.
Thank you, Ambrose. Pleasure.
Once I sang freedom, freedom, sweet as a mockingbird. But I have learned real politics. No freedom for our children in the world of the say-so, only the listening. The silence all around the say-so, the never stop listening. So I will listen to women and our children and powerless men, my people, and I will honour only my people, the powerless. That's the last part of Ursula Le Guin's extraordinary poem, When the Soviet Union Was Disintegrating, from 1991, posted in her last blog post in 2017. Thank you to Ed for speaking with me on the podcast, and for the actual paper and print book which he sent me in the post. Please see the podcast description for links to the book, and to Ed at work and on the socials. And thanks for listening.